Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 10. Today we'll discuss synthesizing different perspectives. Before we begin, you'll need access to the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your weekly homework document, as well as access to at least 2 solutions you may include in your Project 2 draft. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We will define the term synthesis, we'll examine methods for synthesizing various texts, and we'll explore approaches for entering a conversation. All right, let's define the term synthesis. So the term synthesis appears quite frequently throughout Unit 2 already. I mean, heck, we have even an entire project named in part after it with the solution synthesis. So what does that mean? When we synthesize or we construct a synthesis, that's identifying and unpacking the relationship between various sources, as well as sources and your own thoughts. So it's basically just establishing a conversation or saying what the conversation is going on among different ideas and thoughts. Synthesis allows you to better situate yourself within the topic's ongoing conversation. So by saying, okay, well, source A thinks this, while source B believes this, I would say I'm kind of somewhere in between, or I am more inclined to agree with source A, or more inclined to agree with source B. So it really, going back to that spectrum that we discussed last week, it gives us the opportunity to say, well, where do we fit in? Where do our own thoughts and ideas, informed by our own cultures and experiences, where does that situate us among everyone else talking about this topic? When we synthesize a text, and this is something that we're going to see quite a bit in Project 2, is that we want to synthesize to determine where certain sources agree and where they disagree. But to go beyond that binary, we also want to consider how do they extend or build upon one another? How do they respond to each other? Or what other ways are they dialoguing? So, for example, you can say, all right, well, this study is a little old, and so from source A, the study is a little dated. It came out in 2010. So that was source A. Well, source C says, hey, source A, we see that, the last time you published this finding was in 2010. We'd like to build off of what you established almost 10 years ago and publish these results in 2019. And so we're not necessarily disagreeing. We're just saying we're building off of what you've already contributed with the new resources that are available or the new ways to think about a particular topic. I'd highly recommend, not just for Project 2, but for your academic writing and any type of public composition you do in general, use the language presented in They Say, I Say. I think they have fantastic templates for synthesis in there that really gets the ball rolling for how you can effectively establish that dialogue that's already ongoing, as well as saying, here's how I fit in. So, some examples that we could find in the text or that are inspired from They Say, I Say might read, Dr. Erickson's findings agree with those presented in the Department of Education's most recent literacy report. Okay, agree. We are saying that Dr. Erickson agrees with the Department of Education. So we're saying how they're dialoguing. The theories advocated by Eden Lunsford sharply contrast with those of Ong. We're saying, okay, well, if Eden Lunsford present one idea, it's very different, very much the opposite with what Ong suggests. Jones's work extends on Meyer's findings as it accounts for a certain molecular structure that previously went unnoticed due to limitations of available technology. So it's saying, okay, not really agreement or disagreement, it's just when Myers did their work, they were unable to notice this particular structure due to technological limitations, but Jones found it, inspired by Myers' work. So you can see that synthesis, of course, agreement and disagreement are sort of going to be the bread and butter. There are other ways that you can establish dialogue that often do stem from either agreement or disagreement. Let's now talk about language for agreement. When we look at they say, I say, I really like how they position this as agreeing but with difference. And so it gets beyond just that sort of cliched response, yeah, I agree. Okay, why? What does your agreement, like, how do you agree? Do you agree with everything that I say? A little bit of what I say? What exactly is it that you're agreeing with? If I say peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are the best for lunch, are you saying that you agree that sandwiches are the best in general? That PB&J sandwiches specifically are the best? And so when you agree, you want to make sure that you are noting how and why you agree. And I think that's why the agreement but with a difference is such an important way to think about synthesizing various perspectives. And so, because really what that does is it brings a fresh perspective. It says, yeah, I agree. And, coming from this experience, I agree with, person A's idea or person B's idea. So a few ways you can go about this is first, point out unnoticed evidence. So Mr. Carter's argument is intriguing, and I believe we can further his claim by considering the influence of television on teenagers and young adults. So saying, okay, I really like what Mr. Carter is saying about this particular idea. I think we can go a little bit further, though, in looking at how this relates to what he's saying. You can also build off of it with a personal experience, and that's really going to introduce the cultures that inform your agreement with a particular idea. So, after my experience working with marine life, I can affirm the researchers' call for greater awareness for the disposal of plastic bottles. So you're bringing in your own ideas, your own experiences, your own cultures more explicitly to indicate, okay, this is why I agree with this individual. And then even though this is kind of more uncommon, you can also translate convoluted or really complex texts and offer a new kind of way of understanding or approaching a certain type of writing or idea. So Burke's theory on identification might seem complex to those outside of the field of philosophy. Ultimately, he suggests that a speaker should aim to understand the needs of the audience and align their values with those needs. So maybe they say, yeah, I totally agree with Burke, but if you are not in philosophy, it is incredibly difficult to understand what the dude is saying. So here is how and why I agree with Burke, and also here is another way that we can approach his idea. Language for disagreement. And I think that this goes really well with our discussion on rhetorical listening and civility. With disagreement, we want to explain why. So, like I said, when we embrace civil discourse, that does not mean that we have to agree with everything that is brought up. We don't have to agree with a person presenting difference or a straight up counter argument. When we do disagree, though, it is so important to explain why, because that is ultimately what helps us keep the momentum of a conversation going. Even if we have to table it and readdress it later, it's how you frame disagreement that keeps others coming back to the discussion. So first, offer persuasive reasons as to why you disagree. So, in her work, Dr. Grove argues for greater internet censorship, but she fails to take in cultural protocols surrounding free speech to say, okay, I'm not calling Dr. Grove an idiot. I'm not saying that Dr. Grove is off of her rocker or that her study is complete and utter nonsense, but what I am saying is I disagree with her because she hasn't taken account for cultural protocols surrounding free speech, which is something that I value. We also have the duh move. And so with that, that's just kind of stating the obvious to say, this is something that's already in place. This is something that we don't really have to dedicate much of our time or attention to. So, for example, he argues that American education should receive immediate reevaluation, but innumerable studies in various disciplines have already established that need. So that's kind of saying, yeah, I disagree because everyone else has already been saying that. And this is something that we don't really need to address because it's already being addressed elsewhere. And then finally, we can look at it in twisting the original response. So the researchers stress the need for more control over the national borders given the number of individuals entering the country illegally. I agree that there is a comparatively high number of individuals entering the country illegally. However, it only demonstrates the need for immigration reform. So this is really interesting, and it kind of transitions us into the idea we're going to talk about next, where you walk this line of agreeing and disagreeing, but it's saying, okay, we're agreeing that there is an issue in terms of people entering the country illegally. So we can, again, we're finding commonality, we're engaging civilly, we're saying, okay, well, we do agree that there is this particular issue. However, you say that this is the better solution. However, I say this is the better solution. And so again, we're finding those commonalities, but we're still recognizing and respectfully addressing those differences at hand. And then finally, we want to consider language for agreement, disagreement. And I will say, depending on your topic, this will be something you see more often than not, especially as you start to develop your spectrum, because you'll say, okay, well, if we've got the extremes, we've got sort of what we could approach as the binaries of the topic, and we're starting to say, okay, well, this perspective kind of agrees with this extreme in this way, but not so much that it's in a complete agreement. So, like I said, you'll probably see agreement, disagreement more common than not in your synthesis. And I would say just throughout any research endeavor in general, you're more likely to see this occurring. So, there are a couple ways that we can approach this. So we can see this as sort of a yes and no response, like yes and no, let me explain. When you're doing so, there are a couple of ways you can approach it. You can either have a weighted approach in which you favor agreement or disagreement, or you can take a more balanced approach, which is seen through the use of transition, like on the other hand. So first, when we look at a more weighted approach, that's when we say, okay, yes, I really do agree with this idea, but there are some really pressing areas of disagreement that I'd like to address. Or, yes, I disagree by and large, but there are a few areas that I'm super on board with what you're saying. So, if we look at an example of favoring agreement or putting more weight on agreement, we might encounter a text that reads, though the governor's views on commercial land development may be controversial, I agree with her focus on bringing more business to the state. So that's saying, yeah, I'm not a fan of commercial land development and I see it as controversial, but overall it's going to do good things for us. So we can see how that emphasis is put on the agreement because it comes later in the sentence. So when we put more of the weight on disagreement or we prioritize disagreement, it might read something like, Dr. Banks offers a strong argument for consuming only organic foods. However, I cannot accept his evidence dismissing food treated with pesticides. So that's saying, okay, yeah, no, that was a really good argument. I can see where Dr. Banks is coming from. At the end of the day, though, the evidence just wasn't compelling enough for me to dismiss foods treated with pesticides. So when we do take this approach, oftentimes the one that we are favoring will come second, like we see in both of these examples. So they're nodding to say, with agreement, we would first introduce, okay, this is kind of where I disagree, but overall I agree with this sentiment. But when we look at disagreement, we can say we tend to put the agreement first and then follow and emphasize the disagreement we hold because we're putting more weight on that. So with the disagreement example, we say, yeah, Dr. Banks has a super strong argument, but overall, I can't accept that argument, and I can't accept for dismissing this certain type of food growing method. If, however, we are completely balanced and we don't know which side we would prefer to favor more, there is a way we can go about rhetorically structuring that kind of a response. And that is by using a phrase like "on the other hand," and that really does indicate that we're taking a more balanced approach to our entrance into a particular discussion. So, this might read, "I have mixed feelings on Miss Gonzalez's claim. I support her idea," indicating agreement, "that parents should have time off with their newborn children through the avenues of maternity and paternity leave. However, I do not believe it's the government's job to mandate this leave." So we are able, regardless of what comes first, because we could definitely flip it and to say, I don't believe it's the government's job to mandate the leave. However, I also do think that it's important for parents to be home with their newborns. So we can flip it, and it really doesn't have that much impact on how the reader understands your view. So with that, let's talk about the lecture assignment. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to explore or identify 2 solutions to the problem you're exploring for Project 2. On your document, I want you to identify instances in which any of the solutions agree, disagree, agree and disagree. And for each instance, discuss the significance the synthesis has on understanding the topic or problem. So really what I want you to do is to say, okay, well, I've selected, 2 solutions. This is where they agree on, how to address this issue. This is how they disagree on their approach. This is where, we could find some commonalities, or, notice any major differences. And this is why it's important. So if you were to say, okay, going back to our pizza example that we used in the previous lecture, you could say, okay, well, everyone has agreed that we want pizza. However, people are disagreeing if we want meat lovers or veggies. So we could say, well, it's important that everyone agrees on pizza because then that indicates that we're all on the same page for the type of food that we want. However, seeing that some want meat lovers while others want veggie indicate a clear difference in dietary preference that comes up when wanting to order food. So why is that important? And then explaining that as you see the topic. To connect the statements that you're synthesizing, I'd highly recommend to use the templates mentioned in Chapter 4 of They Say, I Say. Really, they are very helpful and can be a great resource, not just for what we are doing in this class, but for a lot of the writing that I imagine that you're doing in other classes and will continue to do throughout your academic career. Weekly homework. All right, now let's discuss the weekly homework. You'll want to include the Core Lecture 10 summary and assignment in your Week 5 homework submission. Overall, your Week 5 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 9 and 10, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. Make sure you get all of that submitted to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 22nd. If you have any questions or if you'd like to chat about any of these concepts in greater detail, please feel free to contact me on Canvas. All right, everyone, until next time.